Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 10th of November, where we are discussing persuasive speeches. I also wanted to discuss registration. Registration is now open, so you can find the spring semester classes on the JCC website. And you can find classes both for the spring semester as well as for the intersession. The intersession is the period of time in January where we don't normally have classes. It's the winter break. It's very condensed taking classes in this particular format. In 3.5 weeks, you would complete basically the equivalent of a 16-week semester. So you would meet Monday through Friday for 3 or 4 hours a day, or its equivalent online. However, the advantage is that at the ending of that particular time period, you would have completed a course. I actually teach public speaking in that format. I find it to be a very useful way of teaching public speaking because there's so much in the way of student participation that it lends itself well to that particular format. Obviously, we don't have as many classes as we would normally have in the spring semester, but if intersession is not for you, you can also find spring classes as well. And I might have mentioned to you that I teach a class in horror film. If you were looking for it, you would not find it in the English section. You would find it under CMN, Communications. And if you look at the notes below, you'll see that I've included a short trailer for the class if it turns out that you wanted to learn a little bit more about it. So you'll see that in the second portion of our notes, we've got some due dates because believe it or not, we're headed towards the ending of the semester. So on the 17th, so this would be next Thursday, we are going to have our third quiz, and we will also be watching some student sample speeches. On the 24th, the Thursday after that, that's Thanksgiving, so we would not be meeting. Speech number 3, which is your persuasive speech, is scheduled for the 1st of December. That's going to be a 15-minute speech. It's the longest of the 3 speeches, and it's going to ask you to use 3 outside resources. Doesn't matter what combination of resources you use. You could use all websites or a combination of books and magazines and websites. I'm not very particular about the way that you format that. It's not like an English paper where you would have to write a works cited page in the MLA or Modern Language Association format. I want this to be a useful exercise for you if you are actually delivering a speech. So when you submit in your speaking notes, as you usually do, you will also be including the 3 resources at the ending of your speaking notes that you used. And again, you don't need to necessarily follow a particular format. It can be MLA, it can be APA. The idea is that if an audience member were to ask you for additional information, you would be able to provide them with that information. So common sense information such as author, the date of publication, things of that nature. So we talked a little bit when we were talking about using library resources about finding information, which you may or may not have found necessary with your second speech, the informative speech, depending on whether or not you discussed a topic that you already had some prior knowledge of. But definitely using outside resources helps to increase your validity, and it helps to increase your persuasiveness. It's one of the reasons why I am requiring that for the third speech. Certainly for this third speech, you can use audio visuals, but you're not necessarily required to use an audio visual. And also, you may make references to yourself in the way you did with the first speech. But again, not necessarily required. So you can see while I've divided up all these speeches into distinct units, really the speech that most people would be delivering would probably be a combination of all three speeches over the course of perhaps a half hour or 45 minutes, where you would be given a topic and then you would be basically left to your own devices to decide whether or not you wanted to make personal references to yourself, whether or not you thought audio visuals would be helpful, and if so, how you would go about that, and which outside resources, if any, you would use. GCC at the noon hour oftentimes has public presentations, so that might be an example of the kind of speech that you might one day be asked to deliver. So even though we aren't meeting in person, I wanted to try to simulate as much as possible. As you know, you've completed your second speech and you've uploaded that. And if you haven't already sent me your speaking notes, please do. And I will be sending you your feedback shortly. And your attendance question today is for you to watch your classmates' speech number 2, much like you watched your classmate's speech number 1, and to send me via email one strength and one weakness of each of your classmates' speeches so that I can compile all of that and present that to you next class when you are also taking quiz number 3. So you'll notice the third section. Oh, well, actually, let me continue on with our dates. So if speech number 3 is going to be due on the 1st of December, that leaves us a class on the 8th of December where we can have quiz number 4. And you can also send me at that point, as we usually do, we can talk about reviewing the speeches of your classmates and sending me feedback, which I can post on the 15th, which is our very last class, and that's our catch-up class. And that would basically end our semester when I share the feedback that you have provided me with for your classmates for the third speech. So this third speech, this persuasive speech, as I indicated, it's 15 minutes. And one of the reasons why it's longer is it's because it's probably the most challenging of the speeches. And you probably are going to be using elements and components from all previous speeches. And I am asking for 3 outside resources. I don't necessarily require you to use a particular kind of resource. I do want you to remember that if you are using the wide open web, you want to make sure that you are using verifiable resources that are valid, which is why I always encourage students to consider using the databases because they've already been vetted, so they've been reviewed on some level, and that you list those sources on your outline when you submit in that outline to me for your third speech. So your job is to contact me prior to the 1st of December, which is when you will be delivering your third speech for your third practice consultation. Again, you get to decide how much or how little to interact with me about that. At the very least, you want to have some sort of email dialogue with me, letting me know what you're thinking about doing your speech about. At the very most, we could meet on Zoom and you could actually present your speech and I can give you feedback or any combination thereof, anything in the middle as well. So the persuasive speech has to be about a topic that is debatable. And that means that you're stating more than a fact, something that reasonable people could disagree about. And what's usually a good technique is to refute the opposing side, if possible, and within reason. It's what I call the elephant in the room. Sometimes there are obvious counter arguments. Rather than pretend that there are no counter arguments to your position, better to just briefly address some of those counter arguments and discuss why they aren't as valid as your particular position. Of course, you don't want to lose control of your particular speech, so now that you're talking about counter arguments, your speech becomes about another position. That you don't want to happen. But doing that and using outside resources can only help to enhance your credibility. Now, how to motivate an audience. And this is a semester in and of itself, which is just discussed very briefly in chapters 14, Argumentation and Critical Thinking, and also chapter 13, Speeches to Persuade. So I just briefly wanted to cover those elements. Motivational appeals, ways to motivate your audience. And again, we could spend an entire semester discussing this, but to simplify, there are basically three ways to motivate. You can motivate through affiliation or belonging, because people want to belong to a group. You can motivate through achievement, the desire for success. Or you can motivate through the desire for power or control. Television commercials will oftentimes do this. I think about, for instance, when they're trying to sell a product. Take something like a car, which is a fairly expensive purchase. You can use the affiliation or the belonging idea that this is the most popular vehicle. Or you can use the achievement or success argument that if you're driving that car, then you're able to afford the lifestyle that's associated with that car. So you're probably driving up to an expensive house. Or the idea of power and control, that you may not have power in your personal, professional life, but you do have control and privacy behind the wheel of your vehicle. So there is one other motivational appeal that works very well, but you need to be very cautious in using it, and that's fear. Fear works very well with motivating an audience, but it also works very well with interfering with reasoning. Again, you'll see the media oftentimes utilize this particular technique. So you have to think about the pros and the cons of using fear and whether the ends justify the means. And think about how fear is oftentimes used, for instance, to try to improve a social situation. For instance, about the fear of lung cancer because of smoking, and showing very graphic images to try to scare the audience. Again, that can interfere with reasoning, but again, the ends might justify the means if that's going to mean a healthier populace. Other times, fear is completely non-essential, but is utilized anyway in order to manipulate. And a lot of this is about manipulation. So you want to be aware for when you're being manipulated. And you want to remember what we discussed at the beginning of the semester, ethics or ethos, that you want to have credibility and that you want to be ethical when you're presenting your own arguments. Now, there was a theorist by the name of Monroe, and he came up with an activated sequence, which I think in many ways discusses the entire process of giving any speech, but particularly a persuasive speech. The first is that you need to get attention, the audience's attention. The second is that you need to establish that there's some sort of need for change, for an audience to either support a position or for an audience to take an action, or perhaps a combination of the two. And you'll probably have three groups in your audience. The group that already agrees with you before you even begin your presentation, and hopefully they still agree with you at the ending of your presentation. If they don't, then you've done something wrong. There is the group that is on the complete opposite spectrum. They will never agree with you, regardless of your presentation. And I always say that the test is not to have everybody agree with you. The test is to have everyone respect you. That it's possible to respect someone, but not necessarily to agree with them. That someone can acknowledge that you've done a good job in presenting the information. And then there's the middle group. Sometimes in politics it's known as the swing group, that it could go either way. That's really the group that you're trying to focus on. And you may not necessarily be able to persuade them in that moment. You might just be beginning to offer the beginnings of a seed that will grow over the course of time. So it might take even years before the elements that you were trying to persuade your audience about take root for a particular person. But again, you've planted that seed, so to speak. So once you've established need, then you want to show satisfaction that your particular position will help to either cure the ill or reduce the negative consequences of the ill. Visualization, and you want to try to be as detailed as possible to show how the new world order would be if people were to take that action or support that position. And if it turns out that you want someone to take action, this is the time to do it. And it depends on your topic as to which might be more challenging. Sometimes it's more challenging to get somebody to take action. Take your very common persuasive speech about eating better or exercising more. Almost everybody will agree with you, but the difficulty isn't getting agreement. The difficulty is getting a change in behavior. Or it could be the opposite. You might be able to get a change in behavior rather easily, but not necessarily a change in sentiment. So someone might be willing to sign your petition, even though they don't necessarily agree with your position, because they think it would be a good photo op, or they're just hopeful that you'll go away if they do that. But that doesn't necessarily change their perspective about the issue. So there are lots of different ways you can go about choosing topics for the persuasive speeches. You can choose certainly controversial, hot button topics. I've always said that if we can't talk about these things in an academic setting, then we can't talk about them anywhere. That said, if you're not comfortable with controversy, you don't necessarily have to talk about very controversial issues. Just review over the course of a day the number of times where you probably remark that you wish something were different. And it could be something rather grandiose, like a political philosophy, or it could be something rather minor, like the establishment of a stop sign at a particular intersection. Again, the idea is that reasonable people could disagree, and you want to present a position. That said, you might want to review some of the work you've done in other classes, particularly English classes, because they often require you to write persuasive papers. So perhaps you can adapt. Obviously, you would have to adapt because writing a paper is very different than presenting a speech, as we've discussed. But that might perhaps spur you on to a topic or an idea that you could pursue in greater depth. So what you need to do is to put together an argument, which basically means that you have a claim or a position, and then you're providing evidence in order to support that position, and you're using some kind of reasoning pattern. And you can see in the notes below that just because something is a claim, that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't something that can be questioned. So a claim of fact would appear to sound like it's something that can't be questioned. But take something like GCC as a small school. Yes and no. In comparison to what? I've certainly had many students say that it's a small school in comparison to perhaps other colleges. But I've had other students say it's a large school in comparison to, let's say, their high school. So even though you're talking about a fact, things like big and small are oftentimes quite subjective. Just like a claim of value, if something is good or bad. GCC is a good school. How do you measure that? Do you measure that through graduation rates? Do you measure that through assessment scores? Do you measure that through interviews and surveys? A claim of policy, that an action should be taken. For instance, GCC should reestablish a sports program. And at one point, we did have a sports program. Many years ago, it was eliminated because of budgetary concerns. And we can debate back and forth whether or not that was a wise decision. Have we saved money, or actually have we lost money because we might have lost enrollment of students who would have been interested in participating in sports? Again, we don't know unless we actually had a way to examine from both perspectives, which is very difficult to do, what would have happened if there was and what would have happened if there wasn't a sports program. So the way that you go about doing this is by using some kind of reasoning pattern. Now, you can reason inductively by examples. Medical studies do this all the time. The idea, if you've got a certain number of medical studies that would seem to indicate that a particular pharmaceutical is effective in curing or alleviating a disease, then usually a correlation is found. But as you know, there oftentimes have been difficulties with medical studies where they found after the fact that what they thought was not necessarily the case. There's deductive reasoning, and this is when you're making a generalization, usually based on examples from the inductive reasoning that you've done. So you take your basic generalization that college leads to success, which is true, but it also is a generalization. It doesn't necessarily apply to everyone in all instances, but there are enough examples to illustrate that that seems to be a truth. Or reasoning from sign, there's some sort of observable mark. So you think about something like when you begin to get the symptoms of a head cold, you might have a sore throat. That sore throat is a sign or a mark where you can deduce, make a generalization that you have a cold because you've induced, there have been enough examples of there being a correlation between a sore throat and a cold that you're able to make that generalization. That said, there are many errors that can be committed in reasoning. We do it all the time when we communicate with one another. Certainly, you want to try to be on the lookout for these errors of reasoning when you are listening to the presentations of others. And certainly, you want to try to reduce these errors in reasoning in your own presentations. And again, this can be an entire class, but just very briefly, the hasty generalization. So you're making an assumption based on too little evidence. I was just talking about registration. The idea, let's say if a class doesn't achieve a number of students in enrollment, then perhaps that class should be canceled because it's not popular. But there could be other reasons why that class is not achieving enrollment, and it has nothing to do with popularity. It could be about the time the class is being offered, or the instructor who's teaching the class, or any number of other variables, not necessarily just the subject matter itself. Or appeal to ignorance, what we don't know. In other words, prove me wrong. So I maintain I'm a space alien, and until you can prove that I'm not, then I am. So the burden of proof has now been shifted from me to you. Or the bandwagon fallacy, the idea of joining the crowd, be like everybody else. I call this the typical teenage argument. Just because everybody else is going to the party, you want to go to the party too. The sequential fallacy, the idea that what comes first affects what comes next. Perhaps, perhaps not. So separating cause and effect can be very difficult. So for instance, if you performed poorly on a quiz and you happen to have, let's say, a migraine that day, perhaps the migraine is the reason for performing poorly on the quiz. However, if you always perform poorly on quizzes, whether you have migraines or not, then there's no correlation between the two. Or begging the question, which is rephrasing the question, a kind of circular reasoning. And think about some of the quiz questions that we've had in the past. What is critical listening? An answer that would be begging the question or rephrasing the question would be critical thinking is thinking critically. Basically, I've just used the words of the question in the answer. Or what is empathic listening? It's listening with empathy. Again, you're not defining what empathy is. So you want to be very careful about that. Politicians will oftentimes do this. Appeal to authority. Now, this sounds like a positive, but the authority isn't necessarily an authority. More often than not, this is someone who is a celebrity or popular, but doesn't necessarily have expertise in the particular area. Advertisers will oftentimes do this with celebrity endorsements, where you've got sports players, for instance, that are endorsing things like a particular beverage, let's say soda. And while they may be popular, so you want to emulate them, so you want to drink what they're drinking, they don't necessarily have expertise in terms of determining one soda over another. But of course, we want to be like them, so we want to try to mimic their behavior. Name calling, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's an attack on the individual, and I've seen this happen more and more frequently in politics, unfortunately. And in my opinion, we've got to find a way to be able to debate civilly. And I wanted you to watch a video that I think really illustrates this point, as well as read an article. You can see this in the fourth section below. The article is from Diverse Education, and it talks about an incident that happened quite a few years ago. And this was between two college debate teams. If you're familiar with debate, basically there are teams of individuals who get together and they put forth an argument, and the other team takes the other position, and then there's a panel of judges that determines which team had the stronger arguments. Usually those judges are made up of faculty from the two competing schools. Well, this was a debate that went badly very quickly because, as much as we'd like to think that we are ruled by reason, the reality is we are often ruled by emotion. So you're probably thinking that something went wrong with the debate teams. That's not what happened. What ended up happening is that the debate coaches were in conflict with one another. So keep this in mind. So these are university professors who are skilled in the field of communications, and they descended into profanity, and also one professor mooned the other, or at least dropped down his pants. He was still wearing his underwear, so I guess we could debate as to whether or not it's a mooning. Now, this was recorded by a student, even though the debate was not supposed to be recorded. Let this be a lesson to you about the ready accessibility of technology. And the student posted this online, and it quickly went viral. And the result of this was that one professor was fired, the one who had mooned, actually the other professor, and the other professor was put on probation. Now, the story behind the debate is complex. They were debating about a very contentious issue, which happened to be about race relations. The two debate coaches had a very strained history because they had debated each other, or their teams had debated each other before. So there was some bad blood between them. And one of the debate coaches was Caucasian male, and the other debate coach was African American female. So you put all of those elements into the mix with them debating about racial issues, and obviously it could easily become an explosive topic. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. So these debate coaches have tried their hardest to have this removed from the internet. Let this be another lesson to you. And I've been able to find it every semester for years now, because every time it's removed, it's replaced. So I believe this link should work. It certainly was working right up until the point of my posting this video, where you can watch a brief exchange. You'll be able to see some of the profanity that goes on between these debate coaches. Again, I'm not necessarily interested in who's right or who's wrong or what they're arguing about. What I'm more interested in is how easily it is to lose control of emotions in very heated situations. And I say that because you are talking about the persuasive speech, and the persuasive speech can oftentimes be about a controversial issue. So I use this as a cautionary tale about making sure that you can maintain your composure when you're delivering, and making sure that you can maintain your composure when you are receiving. And I would hope that our politicians in Washington, D.C. could aspire to do as well as my students have done in the past in terms of this. But I think it's something that is probably going to be one of the most useful skills that you can develop, the idea of learning how to disagree civilly with someone else, and something that I think our society is sorely lacking. So as I indicated, what I wanted you to do today, so I'm going to keep this short, is to watch the speeches of your classmates. That'll be speech number 2, which you would have posted in the top portion of our Moodle site. And I would like you to send me via email so that there's privacy involved. One strength and one weakness for each of the student speeches that you watch, and I will compile all of that data and present that next class along with speech number 3, or along with quiz number 3, I'm sorry, and a practice student speech. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.